as white. And it's incredible that a Nobel Prize can say that, you know, in 21st century. But that's because of the structure of science. So this is like a historical exercise, you know, but in fact it's just to be very careful of contemporary theories. And you have this theory of Lombroso. I don't know if you have heard about this Italian guy in 19th century. He invented this theory that we could see a criminal man just for the face. And then he went to the prisons and took a lot of pictures and made like a classification, and took pictures of the tattoos of the persons and made like relations. And they had, you know, always the same idea. People from Sicilia are the worst criminal because they are from the south, they are dark skinned, you know, and people in the north, they are whiter and they are less criminals. So this same theory was applied all over the world. In the United States was applied even to immigration. For a while, you had people at the entrance of the United States, in Ellis Island, looking at the persons and say, no, this is a Lombroso criminal, go. And you find these descriptions in the novels. You know, for instance, like Agatha Christie, she describes criminals with these still Lombroso categories, with a big nose and like, you know, and they were really very, very archetypical. And in Mexico, they brought some doctors, they brought these theories also, but it was very difficult because in Europe, the people who didn't have hair in the head, like me, were considered criminals. But they say in Mexico, Indians all have a lot of hair, so this is not good. We have to look for a new theory. So they start to making a theory that no, Indians who have lots of hair, that's the point. So they built up, really, it's really funny when we read the books, the scientific books, and they were presented also in this international conference and things like that, and they just classify, and then they say, well, we all know that Indians are all criminals, so it's okay, this, we know that 70% of they are, and they really made even find some structures, you know, and then a criminal who was very famous, and they found the same structure, and they were always building up this kind of theories. And of course that was very easy because they went to prisons. Most people in prisons were Indians because they were poor, nobody defended them, and they stayed there even if they were innocent. And also there were theories and debates about the food. They say, well, Indians don't develop very well their brain because they only eat corn, and corn is not a good food. So the way to civilize people in Mexico was always also to change from corn to wheat, and really was a very strong politics, you know. And Mexican culture, I don't know if somebody has read something about this, based on corn. We have the highest number of varieties of corn all over the world, and the corn was domesticated in Mexico. So really we eat a lot of corn, and now we know corn is very good. But in that time there were no studies, and there were this prejudice that these people didn't have good brains because that was and that's because they were eating this, and because they were, you know, thin and not so tall. So they built all these like charts, you know, of developing childs with North American white population, and of course always Indians, they don't have the same structure, you know? And they were drunk, and you know, the same as you can find in German about Polish people. They are drunk people and they don't want to work. I mean, these kind of prejudices are very strong still today. And also they were showing, and still they celebrate in Mexico, that they were ignorant, you know, people who didn't have culture and didn't have knowledge, for instance, about medicine. So this is very common image, and they were presenting Indians when somebody is ill, and you find in many films and the literature, they cannot do anything. They just start there praying. And you know, we know as a biologist, and I've been working with lots of medicine plants for a while, and we have wonderful medicinal plants in Mexico. Really incredible. We have a lot. And you go to a village in any place in indigenous areas, and people have very good medicine. But they were always presented in this way. And that was you know, they wanted to finish with this medicine, with this way of looking at the human body, and impose this like scientific medicine as, I don't know, there's like the book of Foucault about how the hospitals are born. It's very similar as the 19th century, the doctors were working in Mexico with this idea of this evolution of medicine. And they were considered like they couldn't write, you know, they didn't have, you know, all this. And the worst was this idea of they had like they were criminals and they were violent by nature. So they were like animals. You cannot treat somebody in another way which is not violent, because they are like you have to. It's like horse. You have to beat it. You know. That was in the literature and newspapers. You find all this all the time. These people don't understand. They don't want to become civilized. We have to show them, but they don't want to understand peacefully. We have to beat them, and at the end we have to kill them. You know, that was the. So we have lots of wars in Mexico in the 19th century, all over the country, because Indians were making rebellions because they wanted to preserve their lands and their way of living, and etc. Well, the thing is that we had also this theory of the community, which say that Indians are all the same. You know, you cannot recognize one Indian from the other. Like here in Europe, we have the same with Asian people and with African people. They say all the black Indians. I cannot recognize anyone. You know. It's in Mexico. It's very common. It still is something that you can listen. No, they don't have individuality. They are just like a mass, you know, like people all together, and always like irrational. You know, this group is irrational, and they defend their land irrationally. They don't have reasons to defend that land. It's just like animals, you know, because they are all together like animals are together and react together. So these theories became cliches, you know, like if something disappeared in a house and they have domestic employees, you know, servants, in fact, they are servants, and they are all immediately say, oh, that's the servant who stole this, you know, like this, like here gypsies, you know, there are some gypsies around, that's a gypsy. So this became really something, a way to get in relation from the people in the cities to the indigenous people, not only those who speak indigenous language, but they look like Indians, so they come from an indigenous family. So that's how the racism has been built in Mexico. So this idea of the savage who has disappeared in a way, but we have new representations of the savage. One, for instance, is we had this movement of revolution in 1910, which finished with this very terrible exploitation of indigenous almost as slaves, because that was the result of all this theories and politics, is that indigenous were treated as slaves. They were inside the kind of plantations, you know, haciendas, and they were obliged to work, and they couldn't go out from there, and they were treated really as animals. So we had this rebellion all over the country, make this revolution, and indigenous were presented, you know, in this fight as savages. You know, always this. I don't know if you have seen like the westerns, and you have the Mexicans in the westerns with this, you know, with the bullets here, and they are always like savage, the same as in American Indians. But at the same time, they were presented as when we have this revolution, you have a new government. A new government, they understood that they were fighting against the government who say they were European, white, and they were trying to have as an alliance with Indians, with dark-skinned people, you know. So they built up this theory of mestiçage, you know. So they say nowadays, now we are living in a mestis. You say mestis in Polish? How do you say it?
Metis.
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 Nation. That's the future, because Indians have to disappear. Europeans all are mixed with Indians, so we have like a new country. And all these Indians who have been suffered, we have to help them. You know, that was again this idea of poor Indians. We have to help them to become integrated. It's not the civilized, but it's almost the same, you know, to integrate it to progress of the nation. And the same we start having, you know, where even though the cities were built up with Indians, once they were in the city, if they look like Indians, you know, this is the main square in Mexico City at the beginning of 20th century. And you can see like in Indian already became worker in the city, and some other like functionary of the government or something, and all these Indian people coming. But if they were still looking like Indians, they were always bad treated, you know. So it's racism in the city is very strong because Indians are coming, and as they don't know how society is functioning, the people take advantage of them. So for instance, they take them as workers in the houses, these rich people, and in many cases they don't let them go out. So they become really slaves in the houses of rich people. And they don't know the city, they don't have sometimes relation with the family already, you know. They are isolated, and they have to work from the very early, very late, you know, and have like small room upstairs, you know, on the roof. It's very common, and there are lots of stories of this, the way people take advantage of Indians coming to the city. So, in fact, the idea of métissage, it's you can think it's not bad, because in fact, all human beings, we are all métis. We are mixed, you know. Wherever you go and you make a DNA proof, you can find mixture of everything. You know. Now we accept finally. It was like an old theory that Neanderthal could cross with Cro-Magnon, you know, but long time they were separated as no, Cro-Magnon the best, and the Neanderthal are very ugly, you know, that look more like a gorilla, and Cro-Magnon was already almost Greek, you know? But we know that we are mixed, all of them, all of us, and Indians were not separated all. So the problem with this idea of métissage is that it's like a vertical It's not horizontal, it's like this. And on the bottom, in Mexican society and in many other societies, you have white always, because white means beauty, wealthy, intelligent, everything, you know, active, you know, the other are passive, these are active. So in Mexico, this idea of métissage was a way to control also the population and to integrate indigenous people and to take off the culture and the languages they have. So the government issue from this revolution was the same, doing the same things as the government in 19th century. So they even found in the 30s an Eugenesian society in Mexico. And they were very, very important intellectual persons, you know, who were like ideologists of the revolution, who were part of this Eugenesian, you say eugenics? Yeah, eugenics society. To get better the indigenous race. So the idea was Indians have this strength and they are adapted to the weather and to the conditions of Mexico. But they don't have the intelligence, they don't have the culture of the white people. And so we have to mix them, so that in the mixture we get the best qualities of Indians and the best quality of European. But it was always like this, you know, this is the base, you know, like the land. This metaphor I showed you at the beginning, that America is like not developed, it's a woman, it's passive, it's humid, it's all this a metaphor which works very well for all this relation of domination. Because we live in a very masculine world, you know, metaphors, and the way you control the other is to make them become all like a woman. And in Mexico, still this idea of métissage is that Indians are resistant, are close to land, are productive if they are well fertilized, you know, were inseminated almost, you know. And this idea of eugenics was really strong, because that was a way to get better race in Mexico and in America. And if this mixture was well achieved, an intellectual of 1930, very important in Mexico, still is like a hero, you know, in Mexico. He said, then we have this cosmic race that was like the race of the future. The best elements of European, which is active, intelligent, you know, changing all the time, progress, and this root and base qualities of the Indians. And this is still in the politics and well, the languages was another issue. What to do with Mexico in the beginning of 20th century? I think like 60% of population is still speaking indigenous language. I have the maps, 1940 still, you have like 30% only speaking indigenous language, 60 speaking both, so little Spanish and indigenous, and the rest only Spanish. So what to do with all these people who speak different languages? And they, anthropologists, that's incredible. The government of revolution made like an anthropology department to study all these Indian issues, Indian affairs. And anthropologists say, no, indigenous languages are not good for science. They cannot reproduce, they cannot get the scientific concepts. So we have to finish with these languages. They are very nice, very interesting, but they are not working for, we want to build a big, a nice nation, which was the idea. And think we have to integrate them all to Spanish, you know. Nowadays we know that the best for the people who develop very well are those who speak two languages at the same time, for instance. That's new, this kind of cognitive, you know, image brain and so on. And when a child speaks two languages, is very young, he can get a very good intellectual development, because something happens in the brain. I'm working on this story because it's very fun. In Mexico we have 500 years to don't let indigenous people to speak their own languages, you know, finish this. And many of the indigenous people, they speak both because they have to learn Spanish also to go to school. And they always saying that they are not intelligent, and now science shows that it's the contrary. But the politics, you know, if you study this as the politics in linguistics, you know, for indigenous language, were terrible in Mexico. So really that was like eliminate in the deep, they wanted to eliminate indigenous culture, you know, with this idea of fusion, of métissage. In fact, they wanted to disappear the Indians as a culture. And when they were rebelling, as also as a person, you know, and it's really a miracle that we still have 50 million speaking their own language, because it's been very aggressive. And they made this kind of, I was looking this in the IDO archives, the intellectual proofs they made in Poland, the Nazi in the 30s and the 40s. And it's the same way, you know, they showed these images to indigenous people, for instance, who live in a very dry area where there are no lakes. They live in wood houses, so they don't use keys, you know. They've never seen a boat like this. Impossible when you live in the desert, you know, with cactus. I mean, so they say you have to recognize some of these elements. I mean, the results were, oh, they are really stupid. They cannot recognize anything, you know. So that was very, very classical of all this period, this kind of intellectual proofs or studies. And these studies are also after, you know, this, they say races do not exist. But we have like biotypes, that was a new concept in the 50s. And they were analyzing, for instance, like why Mexicans are having this, you know, like cliché. This is a cliché with Mexican with the sarape and the hat, you know, sleeping. That's fair. So yeah, this is true. Indian Mexicans are like this because they have a problem, physiological, and they invented like theories. But in the 50s, I mean, it's very, very recent. So, what I'm trying to understand in the case of Mexico is how all these clichés became, and this is more difficult to explain because this is like very famous films in Mexico, you know, and everybody knows this, how they built up this image of Indians. And then people, when see these films, very, very traditional, you know, you see it on TV, the family gathers together on Sunday and watch these kind of films. They are watching all these clichés in action. And you have it in telenovelas, you know, all telenovelas are built up like this. You know, there is if there is a girl who lives in a poor neighborhood, and she is white and nice, but the family are like me, you know, not white, and the girl is very intelligent, very nice, very everything, the best. At the end, they find that this girl was given in adoption to this family. You understand why she cannot belong to this horrible neighborhood because she has different nature, you know. We still with these cliches, which in the deep are very, very racist, you know, because they really give like natural attributions or characteristics to people instead of social and this complexity of human beings. And these cliches of the faces, and I mean, it's just the same thing. And the teacher who goes to a little village and wants to civilize all the persons there, and I mean, that hasn't finished. And which is the worst is these cliches. You know, I was trying to think politician who goes to work for the land question, you know, how to improve agricultural in Mexico. And this person has seen all these films with this idea that Indians, and maybe he has never go to an indigenous area or never really talk like in a different way, but only ordering, you know, the Indians bring this, do that. Never has been talking really with somebody like this, has all these cliches. So when they come to an area where there are problems, the way they get in relation with Indians is this always this way of oh, they don't know, they are stupid, they don't want to progress, you know. And when you go to, for instance, now we have plenty of problems in Mexico like this. They want to build, make a new highway to communicate the United States to the Pacific, the Mexican Pacific, because they are making like a commercial route here. And this high road crosses some sacred lands of indigenous people of this area in Mexico, and they are protesting. So they have they go to the high road and stop all the works. And I've been, for instance, in some of these cases, go there, and then you talk to people and you understand why they are asking to stop this, and because they make this peregrination, this pilgrim, yeah, and go to these places, or because their ancestors live there, or because it's the wood, you know, they have this forest and they are working a lot, and they have in this forest on these mountains animals or plants. There are always lots of reasons. And then you see the newspaper of these cities in this area. Ah, Indians again, they don't want progress. You know, they are against the progress. They just want to live the same way as they live, in horrible houses, in horrible conditions. I mean, we are in the 21st century and we have the same ideas as 150 years ago. So what is really horrible in Mexico, I think, is politics are public politics towards indigenous communities are very racist, very, very much. And you know, in education, the way they present indigenous in the school, in the programs, the way they teach history, the way they teach everything about Indians, is horrible. The way they treated, you know, in the health politics, is that they don't have to use the medicinal plants because that's for ignorance. They have to only take Western medicine and so on. So they really, all the politics are to destroy their identity, to destroy their culture, and to control the territories. That's the point now. They want, because Mexican case is interesting. We have all this war against the Indians, you know, by the Spanish and after 19th century and after 20th century, but they were in a very, you know, as Mexico, we have lots of mountains. You see the country, we have like these mountains like this, and in the middle and in the south. So many indigenous people, they are in the mountains, so it's very difficult to control these territories. And they control the territories, so it's always this fight for the territory, almost like meter by meter. So they have lots of resources still, mining resources, oil resources, water, forest, genes, now they are talking about genetics, taking some genes of the animals or whatever. So it's like, very aggressive politics to control these territories. So they have to break down this resistance, which is based in identity, in culture, and relation of these people with nature. So it's something very strong, and at the same time, which is terrible. For instance, this is a case of forced sterilization with indigenous in a region. In the 70s, 80s, they had this policy very strong to not leave them reproduce so much, because they were increasing, in comparison with the rest of the. And so it's slow, all like this. So that's why, for instance, this indigenous artist, he shows the same as I'm with the same cliche, the same idea with the one we started this talk, that you have good Indians and bad Indians. The good Indian is like the bon sauvage, the Rousseau, and he's close to nature, and now we have this ecological paradigm. They are close to the nature, in harmony with the nature, and that's the good one. The bad one is the one who starts protesting because somebody wants to do something to the forest or to the sacred land, or all this relation with the nature. And this is an indigenous painter, very, very good artist. And this is an anthropologist. You can see here it's written anthropologo. And he's got a camera, because all anthropologists have a camera, and all the students in anthropology smoke. I don't know now, but when he made this, it was all the students in anthropology used to smoke in the classroom. So it's very, 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 because that's the problem we have, as anthropologists. In these public policies, you have a lot of anthropologists working. And you cannot understand how they don't get sometimes this racism implicit in politics. So we have the same case, it's not only in the indigenous areas, but the same in the cities, as I showed you the other picture, the photograph of indigenous arriving to the city. And all population in the city who looks like Indians, they are they look like Indians, they are treated as Indians. So we live in a society who has a terrible problem as self-image. Because we live with this image up there, It's nice to be like wealthy, intelligent, pretty, or handsome. It's white, and the rest is not good. So people in Mexico, they have this. I made this. I'm finishing with this. I made this. Research into, I've been working long time, because I was preparing this. I made a book. I can here, this was published in 2009, and in 2011 there was public inquest. They ask people to what they think, and people say yes, we are discriminated because of the color of the skin. I am discriminated because the people say I'm an Indian, and all these insults in the street, in the cities, is you Indian, it's very, very common. But something very interesting is when they come to the skin color. People, they perceive themselves as lighter. So in Mexico we have this that you don't have here in Poland, of course. Women, they put paint the hair like blonde, you know, very much, very common, and they put very white, you know, and they want to look like white, and they perceive themselves as whiter of skin. That's something really very, like, it shows you that there's a kind of problem inside the people, and men also do, less than women, but they do also. So we have really a society who works with these stereotypes and these cliches, you know, very, very strong. And it's also the image that we have built of indigenous. You know, it's rare and very not common to have this dignity in these images, you know, like this picture that is taken from the bottom down, you know, showing like somebody proud of himself, you know, herself. But mainly the contrary, you know, to really show the worst and to increase discrimination in society. So that's why we have this kind of things in Mexico. You know, people, indigenous rising, fighting in the communities, and asking to finish this situation, and the racism so strong in society. I think it's yeah. There.
Thank you so much. I think now we have a little time for questions.
Yeah.
Who would like to start? To bym chciał zadać jakieś pytania. Mogę tłumaczyć.
May I?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about God. You've said about Christians that bad indigene is something who doesn't want to be similar to Christian.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask about God. Christians have their God who is male and white.
Mm-hmm.
What about God in Mexico? Have you many God?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, that's a good question, but it's true, we have. Because the Spanish were very clever to you know, to convince indigenous people, Indians, to become Christians. So they made all kind of fusions with culture. For instance, where there was a very important temple for pre-Hispanic, you know, Maya goddess, they built Virgin Temple, where we have the biggest temple in Mexico City, in Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs, you know. They built the cathedral on the top of they destroyed and the same place, the same basement, they put. So when you go to Mexico City, and you go to cathedral, you know, in the main square, like here, well, like in Krakow, you have the main square with the church. If you go to the bottom, you have Aztec remains. And we have very strong fight with the church, because they don't want to show this. So the archaeologists were been working very hard, and they put like glass, so you can walk around not inside, they didn't accept inside, around the church, and you see that the church, the cathedral, the main cathedral is built up on the Aztec pyramid. And they create the most wonderful virgin in the world to convince Indians is the Guadalupe.
What color?
Brown, dark skin. Yeah, they create this dark skin virgin, and they create this story about their apparition in the place where there was a very important goddess, the goddess of the earth, Tonantzin. So you go the 12th December, which is the day of the Virgin, of Guadalupe, you go to this church, you have 3 million people there coming, you know, from all the country and Latin America and more, you know, the United States, Mexicans, they come. And you come and there are people dancing with this feather and this, the same as you've seen with this Guadalupe Virgin, dancing outside with the drums, boom, 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 the pre-Hispanic dancing. They are built up, you know, this pre-Hispanic, nobody knows exactly how they were, nobody knows anything. But you have these neo-Hispanic groups doing this. But it's really incredible. And indigenous at the end, they identify with this virgin. It's not like a new thing because in Europe we have lots of dark-skinned virgins, or black virgins also.
Black Madonna.
And Christ, Black Madonna, you have, and Christ. And in Mexico that worked very well. The other case is not so well known. Is Cristo de Chalma. It's a black Christ. And also you have thousands of people going there all the time. And they make pilgrim routes to go there, and then from there they go to Guadalupe. I mean, it's something. But what made it indigenous people? They were building the church. So sometimes when you go to church, and when they were making like reforms, you know, or working, behind these images, you had Hispanic image, a sculpture, for instance, of a god. So you had here the Virgin, and behind you have the Hispanic one. So they were very clever. You have cross in the church, and on the bottom, inside the stone, they carved the stone because they were building the churches, and they put a pre-Hispanic figure. So when they went there and made all this, they were praying in their own language to these figures and not to the other. But at the end, we have this Catholicism very mixed with indigenous religions, and very peculiar, different from following in this way.
Good.
Okay, so maybe me first. I just would like to ask if indigenous people in Mexico, if they have their own anthropologists, if they are only described, or if they are able to describe themselves.
Yeah, it's really recent, this. It's like maybe we have like few, you know, anthropologists coming from indigenous communities, very little, you know, like one in place, you know. But now we have really a new generation, maybe they are about 30 years old, coming from communities, very, very, very good, making very interesting research. And we are having changes, but it's not so easy. Sometimes it's not enough that they come from the community, because you know, the way they are educated, also in the way you have to work with the methods, and sometimes the methods are like 19th century. Still you have like traps inside, and the conceptual about, for instance, the relation with nature. Now we have new theories, you know, like ontologies, and this changed very much the relation with knowledge. For instance, I've been working a lot with knowledge, and it's very difficult to get a good theory which shows that indigenous knowledge are similar to science, without, you know, going to New Age things, but really like, I don't know, Bruno Latour works on these things of relation science and other kind of knowledges. But yeah, they are doing, and they are working very, 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 very well, changing. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask, do the Indian people have their representation in some parliament or government? Do you have some people in power that represent their interests? interests?
No, we don't have. That's terrible. Yeah, we have some, yeah, no, like this kind of intellectual people who have indigenous who have studied, but they became not the real representatives of Indian people, but mainly they have become like the contrary. They oppress, and there's like Mexican indigenous people have their own organizations. You know, when there was the Zapatist uprising, they create this like a national organization with representation of Indian people from all over the country, and it was wonderful. I had the opportunity to be there a couple of times, and you really have very good organized people all over the place, and they have this kind of relation of pressure, you know. They block the high roads, they take the government offices, they do this, they make demonstrations, big demonstrations, you know. It's more the way they negotiate, and then they go and sit and negotiate with the authorities, the authorities, local or national. That's always been like this. We don't have like in Brazil, they have like indigenous, you know, at the parliament, really representing indigenous people. We do not have, no.
Who else? What about contemporary art in Mexico? If young independent artists, I don't know, maybe want to take dialogue with these problems, with this segregation or something, if this art exists in internet, for example, in new media, if something like that is you know, important for young artists.
Yeah, the second part of this, but yes, I think it was good just to have this part, because otherwise the time is not enough and you make it tired. It's the exhibition I made about this.
But there is a website, yes?
Yeah, there's a website. But I've been working with artists like this. And yes, well, first you have a lot of indigenous artists, really. Because in Mexico we have a strong tradition of art, painting a lot, photography. When I was working for this exhibition, I couldn't find really artists working in the topic like this, racism, you know, like in other countries, like Brazil. Brazil has lots of people working now, the United States, lots of contemporary artists working on this really issue, very. But in Mexico we have tradition of indigenous topic, you know. So you have the best painters in Mexico, like Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros. They had a lot of painting on indigenous. So it was not so difficult to get these historical representations. And we have colonial art, and we have 19th century very much. But this tradition also comes from indigenous, you know, in many ways. And now lots of young artists, indigenous, are working doing very interesting things. And also artists from the cities, they are working with them. And I've been working like, you know, connecting artists with communities, and then start working on this issue to create something. Yeah, there is I cannot write, but it's the site where I have the exhibition is Exhibir el Racismo. I think I can write it. If somebody is interested, I can write it, or I can make a little paper and we can circulate. And you can see this exhibition there. And I'm preparing like a new one about these languages, and I'm working also with indigenous artists and in indigenous organizations. I mean, the idea is they have their own voice in these exhibitions also.
Any more questions? Okay, maybe me. There's a lot of things coming to my mind after your presentation, so thank you, César. For instance, that my impression is that the racism is not objectively existing. It's always referring to others, other nations. We Poles are not the racism, but there are, for example, British, Mexican, but probably it's the same in Mexico. So Mexicans won't admit that racism exists in Mexico, yes, because we had no colonies, yes.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Another, that racism is something universal, yes. It creates similar institutions, relations, practices, yes, like oppositions, well, I found many similarities to Africa, yes, that Africa is a woman, yes, is infant, yes, is close to the nature, yes, and many others. So it's something universal, yes. I have one question. What were the relations between black people, black Mexican, former slaves, and the Indians, the natives?